Hi, what I want to do here in this brief video is to go over some tips with you in terms of revising your research paper. Now, you will have feedback from me that is specific to your own research paper, but in looking over the submissions of the class as a whole, I keep coming up against the same things, and I thought I would go into a little bit more depth about them. So here are the things that we'll cover. First of all, thesis statements. The importance of a thesis statement that is accompanied by a plan of main points. At the same time as we do that, we're going to discuss what I call the differences between a descriptive paper and an analytical paper. I'm going to talk a little bit about quoting versus paraphrasing. And on the subject of quoting, what we mean by integrating quotations into our writing, and a little bit about in-text citations, and finally the paramount importance of proofreading. So in terms of thesis statements, let's start by looking at a sample of a first paragraph of a research paper. Criminal behavior surrounds us constantly. It is a part of our daily life, something we are all familiar with. However, understanding the explanation for criminal behavior is something the majority of people are not so familiar with. Criminal behavior is related to socioeconomic status and race. This paper examines the correlation between race and crime. Moreover, why Indigenous and Black Canadians are blatantly overrepresented in Canada's correctional institutions. It discusses the social forces and socioeconomic status factor of criminal behavior, and also how those of a lower class are more susceptible to criminal behavior. It also examines of COVID-19's impact on criminal behavior in Canada. Now, there's a lot going on in this paragraph. We can see that there is a topic, but what we need to ask ourselves is whether there is also a specific thesis statement, a proposition that the writer is going to prove. So what I'm going to say first here is that there is a topic. It's about the causes of criminal behavior. But in this paragraph, and by the way, this is from a student paper, there is no clear specific proposition that the author states they're going to prove about the topic. In other words, there's no commitment to the reader to prove something specific about criminal behavior in terms of its causes. What we end up with instead, which is something that I like to call a salad bar, and it's not a complimentary thing, believe me. It's a list of issues that surround the topic, but there is no explanation as to what larger picture those issues fit into, why they are being listed. When I read a first paragraph of a paper like this, such as this, I'm asking, what is likely to follow this paragraph? Because the paragraph itself, the introduction, is not indicating to me clearly what is going to follow in terms of a coherent argument. So what is likely to follow is a descriptive paper, which is to say the student in this instance will likely expand on one topic after another, but not towards the larger goal of proving an overall point. Let's take a look at the same paragraph again. Here I'm showing you the same paragraph again, but let's look at a revised version of the same paragraph. I'm putting them both up here so that you can follow the differences. I'll read the second one. Criminal behavior surrounds us constantly. It is a part of our daily life, something we are all familiar with. However, understanding the explanation for criminal behavior is something the majority of people are not so familiar with. This paper will argue that, although criminal behavior is caused by many factors, two of the most important variables are race and socioeconomic status. This paper will first examine research that makes connections between race and crime including why Indigenous and Black Canadians are overrepresented in Canada's prisons. Then it discusses the social forces and socioeconomic status, SES, factor behind criminal behavior in certain groups in order to prove how those of a lower SES are more susceptible to criminal behavior. So let's examine the differences here. What does the revision do going from the first sample? Well, it has a thesis statement. It states very clearly what it is going to prove. Secondly, by doing so, it indicates that the paper will be analytical rather than descriptive. In other words, it's not going to be just a salad bar of topics, but it is clearly promising to be a sustained argument that uses the points to prove its thesis. Thirdly, this introduction now includes a plan of development, or what we can call a preview of points. What the main points are, and also the order in which they'll appear. What is likely to follow this paragraph? Well, you and I both know very specifically, because it has told us what will follow this paragraph is the first main point that it previewed. Let's take a look at the same revised paragraph in a slightly different way. And what I have done now is that I've color-coded the different parts of this introductory paragraph. And the first part that I have color-coded in red is what I would call establishing the context or the background. In other words, what is the situation within which the student will examine the topic? And I'll read it. Criminal behavior surrounds us constantly. It is a part of our daily life, something we are all familiar with. However, understanding the explanation for criminal behavior is something the majority of people are not so familiar with. Now, the second part of this I've highlighted in green is the thesis statement. And you'll notice that it really foregrounds what the paper will do. This paper will argue that although criminal behavior is caused by many factors, two of the most important variables are race and socioeconomic status. So that's the thesis statement. And then what follows in blue is the sort of preview of points, or what we could call a plan of development. This paper will first examine research that makes connections between race and crime, including why Indigenous and Black Canadians are overrepresented in Canada's prisons. Then it discusses the social forces and socioeconomic status, SES factor behind criminal behavior in certain groups in order to prove how those of a lower SES are more susceptible to criminal behavior. So that part in blue is a very clear preview of what the main points are. And because it uses the transitional words first and then, we know exactly what will come after that first paragraph. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about here quickly is quoting versus paraphrasing in your paper. And the main point I want to make here is that you are welcome to do both. In academic sociological writing, authors quote and they also paraphrase. So there's no rule restricting you from one or the other. When do we quote? Well, we quote when we want to use the force and the precision of an expert's words, the words of an authority, or when we want to use a compelling statistic about a sociological phenomenon. When do we paraphrase? Well, that's when we want to use someone's ideas, but we don't want to use their exact words. Instead, we want to condense their words and to put them in our own words. And by the way, when you paraphrase, you must also cite the source of what you're paraphrasing, because they aren't your ideas. You're giving credit to the person who came up with them. A little bit more on quoting here. And what we don't want to do when we are using quotations is we don't want to simply insert a quotation as a sentence on its own, and this is what's known sometimes as quote dumping. What we want to do instead is to integrate a quotation grammatically in one of our own sentences. The quotation will make sense. We are trying to do it in a way that sort of introduces who the author of the quotation is, and your writing will flow much better. So here's an example of a quote inserted rather than integrated. And it says, "My professor wants us to integrate quotations. Quote, don't just insert a quotation as a sentence on its own," unquote. So the second example here is using the same ideas and part of the quotation, but now we are integrating it into our sentence. And let me read it to you. "According to Professor Laurie, 2024, we shouldn't just, quote, insert a quotation as a sentence on its own, unquote, but instead integrate it into our own sentence." So we've done a couple of things there at once. We've introduced the voice of the quotation. We know it's going to be something that Professor Laurie said, and we've also made our writing flow much better by integrating the quotation into our own sentence. The next thing I want to talk about here is the overuse of quotations and what we do not want to use. What we do not want to do is to use quotations as filler. The emphasis in a research paper should be very clear. The emphasis is on your argument in your own words, not on what I like to call a cavalcade of quotations. In other words, one quotation after another, with a few words of yours inserted between quotations. In that instance, the emphasis is completely backwards in terms of what we should be doing in a research paper. So, in other words, the rule here is use quotations in a minimal fashion. Use quotations sparingly to support what you are saying. And the other thing here, along with on the subject of quotations, is please don't ever begin a paragraph with a quotation, because you're kind of throwing your reader out to sea without telling them what's going on at the beginning of the paragraph. So you need to begin a paragraph with a topic sentence. What is this paragraph about? And then at some point in the paragraph, if you feel you need to support the point you're making with reference to sociological evidence or an expert authority, then by all means integrate a quotation into that paragraph. Let's talk about in-text citations. When you paraphrase a source, all you need to cite is the author and the year. So the in-text citation has the last name of the author, and by the way, not the last name and initials, just the last name of the author. So the last name of the author and the year. When you quote someone directly, you must cite three things now: the last name of the author, the year, and either the paragraph number or page number. So the example here in this in-text citation says Laurie, 2024, and the abbreviation for paragraph, para 1. Okay. I must say, in most of the rough drafts I've looked at, people not including the page or paragraph number when they are quoting. So let's talk last but certainly not least about proofreading. So, typographical errors can be very funny. So I've just picked out a couple of typographical errors for you. But the thing is that when you don't proofread your own work carefully, it really diminishes your credibility. It diminishes the kind of professionalism of what you've written. Now, the issue that I have spoken about before is that when we have worked intensively on a piece of writing, we cannot see our own errors. I can certainly not see my own errors right after I have worked on something intensively. The best thing to do, well, two options really. One is to take a break from what you have written and come back to it a few hours later, or ideally the next day, and then proofread it. Or if you don't have the luxury of that amount of time, please ask a friend to proofread it for you. So those are all the points that I wanted to make with you. Good luck in your process of revising your rough draft towards your final submission.